Laura Harrison had it all: a flourishing career as a marketing executive, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and a husband, Jeffrey, who adored her. At first glance, her life was the epitome of success. But beneath the surface, Laura felt a persistent restlessness, a yearning for something she couldn't quite name. Jeffrey was the kind of man everyone admired: thoughtful, kind, and steady as a rock. He was an architect with a keen eye for detail, someone who could spend hours lost in the precision of his blueprints. He loved Laura deeply, always taking care to nurture their relationship, but his predictability had become suffocating. Their conversations over dinner had dwindled to polite inquiries about each other's days, the spark they once shared now a distant memory. Enter Kevin. Laura met him at a networking event downtown. He was everything Jeffrey wasn't: charismatic, unpredictable, and brimming with an energy that seemed to fill the room. With his sharp suits and confident smile, Kevin exuded a magnetism that drew Laura in like a moth to a flame. Their first conversation crackled with chemistry, an instant connection that left Laura exhilarated and breathless. It started innocently enough. They exchanged business cards, met for coffee to discuss potential collaborations, and soon found themselves seeking each other out more frequently. As weeks turned into months, Laura's attraction to Kevin deepened into something more dangerous. Their meetings became secretive, clandestine encounters in dimly lit bars and out-of-the-way restaurants where no one knew them. Laura's internal conflict grew with each rendezvous. She was acutely aware of the betrayal she was committing against Jeffrey, but the thrill of being with Kevin was intoxicating. She tried to rationalize her actions, telling herself that she deserved a little excitement, that she was entitled to happiness. Yet, a nagging voice in her head reminded her of the vows she had made and the man she was deceiving. In the quiet moments when she was alone, Laura would sit by the window, staring out at the world beyond, lost in thought. She often found herself reflecting on her marriage, recalling the early days filled with laughter and love. Jeffrey had been her rock, supporting her ambitions and celebrating her successes. But somewhere along the way, she had changed, or perhaps they both had. Despite the guilt gnawing at her conscience, Laura continued to see Kevin. The more time she spent with him, the more she found herself slipping into the fantasy of a different life. Kevin made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years, reigniting a passion she thought she had lost forever. She reveled in the spontaneity of their relationship, the unpredictability that made each encounter feel like an adventure. One evening, as she lay in bed beside Jeffrey, her mind drifted to the life she was leading, a double life filled with secrets and lies. She turned to look at Jeffrey, his face peaceful in sleep, and felt a pang of remorse. He didn't deserve this. Yet, the thought of ending things with Kevin filled her with dread, as if she were giving up a part of herself she had only just discovered. Laura's internal struggle intensified, her emotions a tumultuous sea she could barely navigate. She knew she was at a crossroads, but the path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. Part of her longed to return to the safety and comfort of her marriage, to rekindle the love she once shared with Jeffrey. But another part of her was drawn irresistibly toward Kevin, the man who had awakened her deepest desires. Laura's confession to herself: "I never planned for this to happen, but Kevin makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. I wish I could have both worlds, but I know that's impossible. What am I doing?" As she lay there, torn between two lives, Laura knew she had to make a choice. Yet, as the moonlight streamed through the curtains, she realized that whatever decision she made, her life would never be the same again. Laura had never imagined she would find herself in such a predicament, yet here she was, about to propose the unthinkable. She had spent sleepless nights grappling with the idea, convincing herself that Jeffrey, ever the reasonable and compassionate man, would understand her desire for an open relationship. Her internal dialogue had twisted into a mantra: "Jeffrey will understand. He always listens to reason." The thought had taken root, and with each repetition, Laura's conviction grew stronger. The plan was bold, perhaps foolish, but Laura felt she had no other choice. The double life she was leading was unsustainable, and the burden of secrecy was becoming too much to bear. She loved Jeffrey, But her connection with Kevin was undeniable and powerful. She convinced herself that if anyone could comprehend the complexity of love and desire, it would be Jeffrey. He was rational, empathetic, and he trusted her. Surely, he would at least hear her out. The day of the dinner, Laura found herself meticulously planning every detail. The menu was a careful selection of Jeffrey's favorites, dishes she knew would comfort him. She spent the afternoon bustling around the kitchen, the rhythmic chop of vegetables and the simmering of sauces providing a welcome distraction from the storm of emotions within her. She set the table with their best china, arranging candles and flowers to create a warm, inviting atmosphere. As she moved about the house, her mind raced with scenarios of how the evening might unfold. Anxiety gnawed at her, but beneath it lay a determination she hadn't felt in a long time. This was her chance to reclaim her happiness, to construct a life that could encompass all the facets of her heart. When Kevin arrived, Laura greeted him with a kiss, a gesture that momentarily quelled her nerves. She could see the apprehension in his eyes, though he tried to mask it with a confident smile. Kevin had always been the epitome of self-assuredness, but even he seemed unsure about the audacity of Laura's plan. "Trust me, Jeffrey will understand. He always listens to reason." Laura's voice was steady, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her inner turmoil. "Are you sure about this, Laura? What if he doesn't take it well?" Kevin's voice was laced with skepticism, a reminder of the potential consequences they were about to face. Laura paused, meeting Kevin's gaze. "He loves me, Kevin. That's why I believe he'll listen." As the clock ticked toward dinner time, Laura's anticipation mingled with fear. She paced the living room, rehearsing her speech in her mind, trying to find the perfect words to express the complexity of her emotions. She glanced at the door every few minutes, waiting for Jeffrey to return from work. When the sound of Jeffrey's car pulling into the driveway reached her ears, Laura felt a jolt of adrenaline. She took a deep breath, smoothing her dress and checking her reflection in the mirror. Her mind raced with a final surge of doubts and what-ifs, but she quickly pushed them aside. She had to see this through. Jeffrey entered the house, his presence filling the room with the familiar aura of calm that Laura had always cherished. He greeted her with a warm smile, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Kevin stood by the fireplace, attempting to appear casual despite the tension that crackled in the air. "Jeffrey," Laura began, her voice slightly shaky but growing stronger with each word, "I've invited Kevin to join us for dinner. There's something important we need to discuss." Jeffrey looked from Laura to Kevin, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. "All right," he said slowly, clearly sensing the gravity of the situation. The three of them sat down at the table, the clinking of cutlery against plates undoing the silence that had descended upon them. Laura knew that this was the moment, the crossroads where her life could take an unexpected turn. Jeffrey, unaware of the true purpose of the evening, made polite conversation with Kevin, trying to gauge who this man was and why he had been invited to their home. The initial pleasantries were just that, pleasant, but laced with an undercurrent of tension that grew with each passing moment. Laura watched them from across the table, her heart pounding in her chest, a drumbeat of anticipation and fear. She could feel Kevin's unease beside her, his occasional glance toward her seeking reassurance. Jeffrey, ever the gracious host, asked Kevin about his work, his interests, trying to make sense of this stranger sitting at his dinner table. He was curious, of course, but there was an edge to his questions, a subtle probing that suggested he knew there was more to this visit than met the eye. Kevin answered Jeffrey's questions with practiced ease, his charisma on full display, but Laura could see the tension in his shoulders. As the conversation meandered through various topics, Laura felt the moment approaching, the moment when she would have to lay bare her heart and her intentions. As they ate, Laura's mind swirled with rehearsed lines and heartfelt confessions. She glanced at Kevin, who nodded almost imperceptibly, urging her to begin. Gathering her courage, Laura finally spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "Jeffrey, I've been thinking a lot about us, about our lives together. There's something I need to share with you, something that's been weighing on me for some time." She paused, searching his eyes for understanding. Jeffrey set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening, Laura," "What is it?" he asked, his gaze flickering briefly to Kevin and back to her. Taking a deep breath, Laura forged ahead, ready to unveil the truth and face whatever came next, hoping against hope that Jeffrey's reason and love would guide them through the storm. "This is Kevin," Laura said, gesturing to her lover, her words hanging heavily in the air. "He'll be moving in with us. I want you to share me with him. You can't say no, or he will smash you like a buck." For a moment, silence reigned. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, punctuating the void where words should have been. Jeffrey's face remained unreadable, his eyes fixed on Laura, as if he were trying to decipher a complex puzzle. The tension in the room was palpable, a living thing that seemed to press down on them all. Laura's heart raced, her breath caught in her throat as she waited for Jeffrey to react. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, but reality was far more daunting than she had anticipated. Jeffrey didn't speak. He didn't shout or rage or storm out of the room. He simply sat there, his eyes locked onto Laura's, his silence more eloquent than any words he could have uttered. It was a silence that spoke of shock, of disbelief, of betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. Laura's pulse thudded in her ears, a cacophony of doubt and fear. Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly feeling the weight of the moment. The bravado he had displayed earlier seemed to have evaporated, leaving him exposed and uncertain. He looked to Laura for guidance, but she was as lost as he was in the echoing silence. Finally, Jeffrey spoke, his voice low and measured, carrying a weight of emotion that belied his calm demeanor. "Laura," he began, his gaze never wavering, "I need you to explain what the hell you're asking of me." Laura swallowed hard, the enormity of her proposition crashing over her like a tidal wave. "I love you, Jeffrey," she said, her voice trembling with the intensity of her emotions. "But I also love Kevin. I thought maybe we could find a way to make it work." Jeffrey leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing briefly as he absorbed her words. When he opened them again, they were filled with a pain that pierced Laura's heart. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice raw and vulnerable. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, as Laura and Jeffrey stared at each other across the table, the gulf between them wider than it had ever been. Laura's proposition hung in the air, a catalyst for change that had the potential to shatter everything they had built together. Laura felt her resolve falter, doubt creeping in like a shadow. Had she made a terrible mistake? Was her desire for more leading her down a path from which there was no return? In that moment, Laura realized that whatever happened next, the delicate balance of their lives had been irrevocably altered. There was no going back, only forward, into the uncertain future that awaited them all. The silence that followed Laura's proposition was suffocating, a tangible weight that pressed down on everyone in the room. Jeffrey's eyes bore into hers, a mix of confusion, hurt, and anger flickering across his features. He sat motionless, as if rooted to the spot, his mind processing the enormity of what had just been laid before him. Finally, Jeffrey stood up, pushing his chair back with a deliberate slowness that made Laura's heart skip a beat. She watched him, her mind a whirl of anxiety and regret, as he walked out of the dining room without a word. The sound of his footsteps receded into the distance, leaving behind an echoing emptiness that filled the space between her and Kevin. "What's he doing?" Kevin whispered, his voice barely above a breath, the tension palpable in every syllable. He glanced toward the door Jeffrey had disappeared through, a flicker of fear crossing his face. Laura shook her head, unable to find her voice. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm of uncertainty and dread. She had anticipated anger, perhaps even a heated argument, but not this silence, not this ominous retreat into the unknown. Minutes stretched into eternity as Laura and Kevin sat in uneasy silence, the ticking clock marking the passage of time with relentless precision. Every second that passed without Jeffrey's return only heightened their sense of foreboding, the tension mounting like a storm gathering on the horizon. Then, abruptly, Jeffrey reappeared in the doorway, rifle clutched in his hands. The sight of the weapon sent a jolt of fear through Laura, her breath catching in her throat. Jeffrey's face was a mask of cold determination, his eyes devoid of the warmth and kindness she had come to rely on. Kevin's reaction was immediate and visceral. He shot to his feet, his chair toppling over with a crash, his face draining of color as he stared at Jeffrey in disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" Kevin blurted out, his voice high-pitched with panic. "You think I'll just let this happen?" Jeffrey's voice was low, steady, a quiet storm of fury and betrayal. He took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Laura, his words cutting through the air with razor-sharp precision. "You've underestimated me, Laura." Laura felt the room spin around her, the ground shifting beneath her feet. This was not how she had imagined things would unfold, not the outcome she had envisioned. The reality of her choices crashed down on her, a wave of consequence and regret that threatened to drown her. "Jeffrey, please," she began, her voice trembling as she tried to bridge the chasm that had opened up between them. "I didn't mean for it to come to this. I just thought, you just thought you could walk all over me," Jeffrey interrupted, his grip tightening on the rifle, his gaze never leaving hers. "That you could take everything we've built and throw it away like it meant nothing." Kevin edged toward the door, his eyes darting between Jeffrey and the path to freedom, his body tense with the instinct to flee. "Look, man, let's just calm down, okay?" he said, his voice shaky, trying to diffuse the situation. "There's no need for this." But Jeffrey was beyond reasoning, his emotions a turbulent sea of betrayal and heartbreak. He raised the rifle, leveling it at Kevin with a grim finality that left no room for misinterpretation. "Jeffrey, don't," Laura pleaded, her voice breaking as she reached out toward him, desperation clawing at her heart. "Please, let's just talk about this." Jeffrey's gaze flicked to Laura, a flicker of something, hurt, perhaps, passing through his eyes before the steely resolve returned. "You want to talk, bitch? After everything?" he said, his voice a mixture of incredulity and bitterness. "I'm done talking." Kevin made a sudden dash for the door, his movements a blur of panic-driven urgency. But Jeffrey was faster, stepping to block his path, the rifle still trained on him. The tension in the room was electric, a taut wire stretched to its breaking point. Kevin's desperation driving him to escape at all costs. The chair he had knocked over lay forgotten on the floor, a testament to his frantic bid for freedom. Jeffrey, fueled by a potent mix of anger and betrayal, was relentless in his pursuit, his footsteps echoing through the hallway as he chased after Kevin. The front door slammed open, and Kevin stumbled into the night, his heart pounding in his chest like a wild drumbeat. His mind raced, a jumbled mix of fear and disbelief at how quickly things had spiraled out of control. He had never imagined that Laura's plan could lead to such a volatile confrontation, yet here he was, running for his life. The cool night air hit him like a shock, but there was no time to savor it. Behind him, Jeffrey's determined footsteps grew closer, a chilling reminder of the danger that nipped at Kevin's heels. The neighborhood, usually so peaceful and quiet, now felt like an alien landscape as Kevin sprinted down the street, his lungs burning with every ragged breath. Inside the house, Laura stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and horror. She had never intended for things to escalate to this level of violence, never dreamed that her husband could be pushed to such extremes. Yet, as she listened to the sounds of the chase echoing through the open doorway, she realized that her actions had unleashed a storm that she could no longer control. A sickening mix of guilt and fear churned in her stomach as she rushed to the door, her heart aching with the realization of how deeply she had underestimated Jeffrey's capacity for fury. The man she had known for years, the man who had always been a pillar of calm and reason, was now a stranger driven by rage and betrayal. "Please," Kevin gasped, his voice carrying through the night as he glanced over his shoulder at Jeffrey, who was closing the distance between them with alarming speed. "I didn't mean for it to come to this." "You made your choice when you walked through that door," Jeffrey replied, his voice a cold blade that cut through the air, each word laced with the raw emotion of a man pushed to his limits. Kevin's heart sank at the unyielding resolve in Jeffrey's voice, a clear indication that there would be no reasoning with him. His legs burned with exertion as he pushed himself harder, desperation fueling his flight as he veered off the street and into a nearby park, hoping to lose Jeffrey among the trees and shadows. The park was dark and unfamiliar, its winding paths and dense foliage providing some semblance of cover as Kevin ducked behind a cluster of bushes, trying to quiet his ragged breathing. He pressed himself against the ground, his pulse hammering in his ears as he strained to listen for any sign of Jeffrey's approach. Minutes stretched into agonizing eternity as Kevin lay hidden, each second a reminder of the precariousness of his situation. His mind raced with possible escape routes, but each one seemed fraught with danger, the likelihood of evading Jeffrey dwindling with every passing moment. Meanwhile, Laura stood at the edge of the driveway, her hands trembling as she stared into the darkness, hoping against hope that Jeffrey would come to his senses and abandon the chase. Her heart was a twisted knot of regret and fear, each beat a reminder of the decisions that had brought them to this point. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, the stillness of the night amplifying every sound, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves, the faint call of a night bird. And then, finally, the sound she had been dreading, a sharp crack that shattered the silence, reverberating through the air like a final, terrible punctuation mark. The sound jolted Laura from her paralysis, her heart leaping into her throat as she stumbled forward, driven by a desperate need to understand what had just happened. The echoes of that single shot rang in her ears as she moved toward the park, fear propelling her forward, her mind a whirlwind of worst-case scenarios. The night's chaos had faded into a tense and haunting silence, leaving Jeffrey standing alone in the park. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the confrontation ebbed away, leaving behind a hollow emptiness and an overwhelming sense of disbelief. His rifle hung loosely in his hands, the weight of it a tangible reminder of how far things had spiraled out of control. The moon cast a pale glow over the park, its light filtering through the trees and illuminating Jeffrey's face. His expression was one of weary resignation, the lines of anger and determination slowly softening into something more profound, a reflection on the choices that had brought him to this point. "There's no going back from this," he murmured to himself, the words a stark acknowledgement of the irreversible path they had all taken. He couldn't shake the image of Kevin's fearful eyes from his mind, nor could he forget the look of betrayal on Laura's face when he had confronted them both. Jeffrey had always prided himself on being a rational and composed man, but the events of the night had shattered that self-image. His actions had been driven by a primal fury, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed until it had erupted to the surface. Now, standing in the aftermath of that eruption, he was left to grapple with the reality of what he had done. Slowly, Jeffrey turned and began the walk back to his home, the rifle tucked under his arm, each step echoing with the weight of his thoughts. He knew that the path ahead would be fraught with difficult conversations and painful realizations, but he was determined to face them, to understand how their once loving marriage had unraveled so completely. Meanwhile, Laura sat on the front steps of their home, her face buried in her hands as she tried to comprehend the enormity of the night's events. The sound of that single gunshot still echoed in her ears, a chilling reminder of the consequences of her choices. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain of her despair. In the quiet of the night, Laura reflected on the journey that had led her to this moment, the growing restlessness in her marriage, the thrill of her affair with Kevin, and the naive belief that she could have it all without consequence. She had been blinded by her desires, unable to see the damage she was inflicting on the people she loved. As she sat there, the realization of what she had lost began to sink in. Kevin was gone, his presence in her life reduced to a fleeting memory, and Jeffrey, the man she had promised to love and cherish, was now a stranger standing on the precipice of a future that seemed uncertain and daunting. Laura's mind raced with thoughts of what could have been done differently, of the conversations she should have had with Jeffrey before things had spiraled so far out of control. The weight of her mistakes was crushing, a constant reminder of the lives that had been irrevocably altered by her choices. The sound of footsteps drew Laura's attention, and she looked up to see Jeffrey approaching, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze meeting hers with a searching intensity that made her heart ache. "I didn't mean for it to end like this," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper, the sincerity of her regret clear in every syllable. Jeffrey nodded, a slight motion that spoke volumes. Neither did I, he replied, his voice tinged with sadness and the acceptance of their shared reality. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair as he looked up at the stars, as if searching for answers in the vastness of the sky. There's no going back from this. In that moment, they both understood that the future would be shaped by the choices they made now. As the night stretched on, Jeffrey and Laura remained there on the steps, two souls caught in the aftermath of their actions, searching for a way forward amidst the chaos and confusion. In the soft morning light, the events of the previous night seemed like a distant nightmare, yet the emotional scars were raw and real. Laura awoke on the couch, where she had finally drifted off, the weight of her choices pressing heavily on her heart. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the fog of exhaustion, and realized that she had to face the reality of what lay ahead. Jeffrey sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him as he stared out the window. The world outside continued its rhythm, birds singing in the trees and cars passing by, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil that had consumed their lives. His mind was a swirl of emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness, but beneath it all was a desire to find a way through the wreckage. Laura hesitated at the doorway, watching Jeffrey's profile as he lost himself in thought. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation they needed to have, the conversation that would determine the course of their future. "Jeffrey," she said softly, stepping into the kitchen. Her voice was tentative, laced with the vulnerability of someone who had seen her world come crashing down. He turned to look at her, his eyes weary but attentive. "We need to talk," Laura continued, her heart pounding with the fear of what his response might be. She had spent the night reflecting on her actions, on the selfishness and impulsivity that had driven her to risk everything they had built together. She knew she owed him an apology, but she also knew that words alone might not be enough. Jeffrey nodded, gesturing for her to sit across from him. The space between them felt vast, filled with unspoken words and unresolved emotions, but it was a start, a fragile beginning to what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. "I was wrong, Jeffrey," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her confession. "I see that now. I should have talked to you, should have tried to fix what was wrong between us instead of looking elsewhere. I'm so sorry for everything." Her words hung in the air, an offering of remorse and regret, an acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. She held her breath, waiting for Jeffrey's response, her heart aching with the hope that there was still a chance to salvage what remained of their relationship. Jeffrey met her gaze, his expression softening as he considered her apology. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the remorse that reflected his own pain. "I was so angry, Laura," he admitted, his voice low and steady. "I felt like everything we had meant nothing to you, like I was nothing to you." They sat in silence for a moment. Jeffrey had spent the night reflecting on his own actions, the way he had let his emotions drive him to a place he never thought he would go. He realized that he too had a role to play in the distance that had grown between them, that perhaps he had taken their relationship for granted. "We have to find a way forward, whatever that may be," Jeffrey said finally, his voice carrying a quiet determination. Whether it meant rebuilding their marriage or parting ways, he knew that they needed to confront their issues head-on, to be honest about their feelings and desires. Laura nodded, relief flooding through her at his willingness to try. "I want to make things right, Jeffrey. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." They talked for hours, discussing the hurt and the misunderstandings that had led them to this breaking point. It was a difficult conversation, filled with tears and revelations, but it was also cathartic, a necessary step in the healing process. Both of them acknowledged the changes they needed to make, the communication they needed to rebuild if they were to have any hope of moving forward together. As the day wore on, a sense of tentative hope began to emerge from the ashes of their conflict. They knew that the road ahead would be challenging, that it would require patience and forgiveness, but they also knew that they were willing to try. Whether that meant reconciliation or ultimately deciding to part ways, they were committed to doing what was best for both of them.